Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving into a really fascinating case from the world's highest court, where a decision that was supposed to be final, well, it turned out not to be so final after all. It's a story about a river that literally moved, a map that was rediscovered, and a huge legal battle to try and rewrite a border. And that really brings us to the big question for this whole thing. Can a decision that is supposed to be the absolute last word, legally binding, totally final, can it ever actually be overturned? It's incredibly rare and super difficult to do. But as we're about to see, that doesn't stop countries from trying. Okay, so let's set the scene here. Picture this. The year is 2002. It's been a full 10 years since the International Court of Justice made its ruling on a really complex border dispute between El Salvador and Honduras. Everybody thought the case was closed, done. But then El Salvador walks right back into the Peace Palace in The Hague with a pretty bold request. They wanted the court to completely revise its 1992 judgment. So what was El Salvador's argument? They weren't just appealing the decision. They were filing for something called a revision, and they were claiming that they had discovered brand new facts so important that they would have totally changed the outcome of the original case. This was a massive, high-stakes legal gamble. Their first huge claim was all about the Guascaran River, which makes up part of the border. El Salvador came to the court and said, hey, we have new scientific and historical proof that this river hasn't always flowed where it is today. Their argument was that it had violently and suddenly jumped its course hundreds of years ago. And this is where we get into a really cool legal idea called avulsion. See, when a river that's a border slowly, gradually shifts over time, the border just moves with it. But, and this is the key part, if it changes course suddenly, say in a massive flood, the border legally stays right where the old riverbed was. This one concept, avulsion, was pretty much the entire foundation of El Salvador's new case. But wait, there's more. El Salvador's lawyers had also been digging through archives, and they tracked down another piece of evidence they thought was a total smoking gun. A new copy of a critical 18th century map, found thousands of miles away in a library in Chicago. So let's just quickly recap what they were bringing to the table. First, they said they had scientific proof of this sudden river change, this avulsion, way back in 1762. Second, because of that, the real border should follow the river's old path. And third, this newly found map, the Carta Esférica, would help prove it all. They were absolutely convinced that these new facts were decisive. But here's the thing. You can't just walk up to the world's highest court and ask for a do-over. The rules are unbelievably strict. The court does not want countries constantly re-fighting old battles. So there is a very specific, very high legal mountain you have to climb, and it's all laid out in Article 61 of the court statute. And just how high is that mountain? Well, to even get your case for revision looked at, you have to pass this 5-point test. First, it has to be a newly discovered fact. Second, that fact has to be decisive. It has to be so important it would have changed the original outcome. Third, it had to have been unknown to both the court and you when the first case happened. Fourth, and this is crucial, you can't have been ignorant because of negligence. You can't just fail to do your homework and then ask for a second chance. And finally, you gotta file on time. You have to pass every single one of these. Fail just one, and your case gets tossed right out. So how did this all play out? The arguments were made, the rules were clear, the judges had to decide. Did El Salvador's new evidence about the river and the map actually meet this incredibly high bar? And the answer was a big, resounding no. By a vote of 4-1, the judges said El Salvador's application was inadmissible. They wouldn't even re-examine the case. The door was slammed shut. But why? And this is where we get to the absolute heart of the court's reasoning, and honestly, it's a bit of a shocker. In the judgment, the chamber wrote this incredible line. It does not matter whether or not there was an avulsion of the Guascaran. How could it not matter? It was the central piece of their new evidence. Well, it turns out El Salvador had completely misunderstood the basis of the 1992 ruling. See, the original judges didn't base their decision on geology or where the river used to be. They based it on the conduct of the two countries for the last 100 years. Back in '92, they decided that El Salvador's claim to the old riverbed was a pretty new argument and wasn't consistent with the history of the dispute. So even if El Salvador now had perfect proof the river moved, it wouldn't have changed that original legal reasoning. The new fact just wasn't decisive. Okay, so the river argument totally failed the decisive test. But what about that other piece of evidence, right? The rediscovered map from that library in Chicago. Surely that had to make a difference. Yeah, well, that turned out to be another dead end. When the judges actually compared the new Chicago map with the copies they used in the original case, they found they were almost identical. The Chicago map showed the river mouth in the exact same spot as the old evidence. So far from overturning the 1992 findings, the court said this new map basically confirmed them. So once again, it failed the decisive factor test. But hold on, remember that vote? It was 4-1. There was one judge, Judge Ad hoc Pailio, who was chosen by El Salvador, and he strongly disagreed with everyone else. And his dissenting opinion gives us this fascinating window into the philosophical debate going on right at the heart of this case. So the big disagreement really came down to a different interpretation of the 1992 judgment. The majority was firm. The original decision was based on the history of the dispute, on how the countries had acted. But Judge Paulillo, he argued something different. He believed the real reason El Salvador lost back in '92 was simply because they couldn't prove the avulsion had happened. They just didn't have the scientific evidence. So now that they had it, he thought the court should hear them out. And this quote from his dissent really gets to the core of his argument. He felt like the court was just missing a huge opportunity. By saying the application was inadmissible, they were preventing a decision based on what he saw as way more extensive and reliable information. He basically argued that the interests of justice would be better served by looking at all the facts, new and old, and making the best possible decision. So what does this all really mean? This whole case wasn't just about a river or a map. It shines a bright light on this fundamental tension that exists right at the very core of our legal systems, this constant struggle between finality and justice. Think about it. On one hand, the law needs finality. For society to work, disputes have to have an endpoint. A judgment from the world's highest court has to mean something. But on the other hand, you have this pursuit of perfect justice, the idea that we should always use the best, most complete information to get to the right answer. And this case puts those two powerful ideas head to head. And that leaves us with a really provocative final thought. In the end, the court chose the principle of finality. It upheld the stability of its past judgments over the chance to re-examine the case with new info. And it forces us all to ask, when is the need for a conclusive, final answer more important than the unending search for the perfect one? It's a question with no easy answer, and it's what makes this case of the moving border so absolutely compelling.